A veteran bought a haunted cabin for $200. Dog's bark revealed a truth. Hidden for decades, the wind battered the cabin like a beast trying to claw its way in. Snow fell in heavy sheets, blurring the view of the woods outside. Inside, the fire crackled faintly, its light flickering against the log walls, barely holding back the cold. Nate Grayson sat hunched near the hearth, hands outstretched toward the warmth, wrapped in a flannel shirt and military-issue wool socks. It was his first night in the place, and the silence was just starting to settle into something that resembled peace. Then, Hunter growled. Not a bark, not a warning. A deep, guttural sound, low and vibrating, like something pulled from the gut of the earth. Nate turned, instantly alert. The German shepherd wasn't facing the door. He had turned away from the storm entirely and now stood rigid, ears pinned, tail still, eyes locked on the base of the fireplace. "What is it, buddy?" Nate asked quietly, standing up. Hunter didn't move. His eyes didn't leave the hearth. His whole body was one coiled line of tension, the same way he'd stood in Afghanistan that night before they uncovered the buried pressure plate bomb. Nate's breath caught. He hadn't seen that stance in years, and he never saw it without reason. He took a slow step forward. The firelight cast shadows across the uneven stonework of the fireplace. Just behind the flames, the stones looked solid, unmoving, ordinary. But Hunter didn't think so. Nate knelt next to him, keeping his hand close to the dog's shoulder. The old shepherd gave a soft whine, still locked onto the stone like it had said something unforgivable. Nate reached toward the hearth and touched the outer rim. Cold, nothing out of place. But Hunter growled again, louder this time. The air shifted. Nate wasn't sure how to describe it, like pressure in a room before a storm hits, or that sensation of being watched in the dead of night. He looked around the cabin. It was empty, save for the dust and the scent of ash and damp timber. And yet it felt full, not with presence exactly, but with tension, like something had been waiting. He stood slowly, his gaze falling to the bag in the corner. A few supplies, a sleeping bag, a crowbar he'd bought from the hardware store that morning. His instincts clicked into place. If Hunter said something was wrong, it wasn't a question. The dog had never failed him. Earlier that day, Nate had stood alone in the county courthouse annex as the property auction rolled on. He was the only bidder for Parcel 12B, better known locally as the Murrow Cabin. No one raised a hand when he offered his $200 starting bid. No one even looked surprised. A few looked away. One old man in the front row shook his head slowly, as if silently warning him. And now here he was, alone in a storm, with a dog staring down a pile of stone like it was hiding something alive. Nate grabbed the crowbar from the bag and returned to the hearth. He looked at Hunter. "You're sure?" The shepherd didn't move. His breath was slow, even, focused. That was enough. Nate crouched low and began tapping gently along the stones at the base of the fireplace. At first it was all solid, but when he reached the third stone from the left, a wide, flat slab, he heard it. A difference. A dull, hollow sound. He tapped again. Same result. He glanced at Hunter, whose ears twitched at the sound. The dog gave a short, expectant huff. Nate slid the crowbar into the edge where mortar met stone and pried gently. Nothing. He repositioned, pushed harder, feeling the resistance, then a sudden give. The mortar cracked, not like old crumbling mix, but like a seal. The stone shifted. Just a hair. He set the crowbar aside and wedged his fingers under the lip. It was heavier than it looked. He grunted, pulling it back and out. The moment it cleared the hearth, the temperature seemed to dip. Hunter took a cautious step closer, peering down. A hole. Roughly 2 feet wide, descending into darkness. Man-made, not a natural depression. Nate grabbed his flashlight and aimed the beam downward. It wasn't a pit, it was a chamber. Shallow, maybe 3 feet deep, lined with flat stones, dry and well built. At the bottom, nestled between dust and cobwebs, sat a metal box, olive drab, the kind he hadn't seen since his service. And next to it, 3 leather-bound notebooks, tied with brittle string. Nate didn't speak. He reached into the hole and pulled the box out. It was heavy, cold, familiar in a way that made his stomach tighten. He placed it on the floor and picked up the journals next. The string disintegrated in his hands, and the covers cracked when he opened them. Neat, blocky handwriting filled the yellowed pages. Hunter sat next to him now, close enough that Nate could feel the warmth of his body. The dog was calmer, but not relaxed. He was still watching the fireplace. Nate flipped a few pages. Names, dates, chemical reports, notes about wells and water tables. In the corner of one page, a name, E. Miles. He'd heard that name once. Edgar Miles. The reporter who vanished without a trace 20 years ago. The one whose truck was found rusted out not far from here. The man people in town still whispered about, but never named directly. Some said he'd gone off-grid. Some said he'd pushed too hard on the wrong people. Others said nothing at all. Nate closed the journal and looked at the box. He hadn't opened it yet. He didn't need to, not tonight, because Hunter wasn't growling anymore, but he wasn't at ease either. He sat still, facing the dark fireplace, tail curled tightly around his side, as if guarding something, or waiting for it to return. Nate stood, brushing dust off his knees. "You found it," he said softly. "Whatever it is, you found it." The wind screamed outside. The fire cracked in the hearth. The room felt heavier, as if it was holding its breath. Hunter lay down finally, but his eyes never left the cold stone. And Nate knew. This wasn't just a haunted cabin. This was a vault someone had tried to bury, a truth hidden beneath decades of silence. And now, thanks to a dog's bark, it had been heard. Hunter lay at Nate's feet, still watching the hearth like it might shift or speak. The fire crackled low, casting wavering shadows across the log walls. Outside, the storm raged, hammering the roof with sheets of snow and wind sharp enough to howl. But inside, for now, it was still. Not peaceful, just still. Nate leaned back against the cabin wall, a thick wool blanket pulled over his legs. He wasn't tired, not in any real way. His mind was running too fast for that. The metal box he'd pulled from the hidden chamber sat closed on the table, untouched since he'd carried it up from the hearth. He could feel its weight even from across the room, but his focus, like Hunter's, kept drifting back. He looked down at the dog. 9 years old now, still sharp, still built like a 4-legged tank. That rare steel-grey coat rippled with every breath. His ears twitched in response to every sound, the wind, the crack of the firewood, the creak of the cabin. But his eyes never left the hearth. "You remember Kandahar?" Nate asked softly, almost smiling. Hunter didn't react, but Nate kept going. Talking helped. It had been a dusty road in the middle of nowhere, late afternoon, shadows long, heat still radiating off the sand. They'd been moving slow, standard patrol, routine sweep. Nothing routine ever ended well. Hunter had frozen mid-step, his paw hovering above a patch of ground that looked no different than the rest. Ears forward, tail stiff, the kind of stillness that sucked the air right out of Nate's lungs. Seconds later, they uncovered the IED. 2 wires, a metal plate, pressure trigger, buried an inch from where Nate would have stepped. Hunter didn't bark that day either, just sat down calmly, like he was telling them, "This is as far as we go. Later that night, Nate had patched a gash on the dog's leg from a broken bottle they hadn't seen in the rubble. He remembered Hunter sitting there like a damn statue, not even a flinch when the antiseptic stung. "You didn't even growl," Nate murmured now, reaching down to scratch the dog behind his ears. Hunter leaned into the touch, but just barely. They'd been inseparable ever since. Nate hadn't planned to adopt him. That decision came after the injury, after the blast. Not the bomb, something smaller. A wall collapse, shrapnel to the shoulder. Enough to end the career, but not the guilt. Nate had made it home in one piece. Most of his friends hadn't. Hunter came with him. The VA therapist had called it mutual recovery. Said dogs could help stabilize PTSD symptoms, create a routine, a bond, ground you. Nate never told her the truth. That some nights Hunter was the only reason he didn't open a bottle he couldn't close. The cabin was supposed to be a new beginning. Fresh air, quiet, no eyes watching, no traffic, no hum of fluorescent lights. Just trees, snow, and enough distance to finally let everything settle. But now this. He glanced at the fire again, then at the metal box, then at the hearth. "Why this place, huh?" he whispered. "Why now?" Hunter let out a soft woof, not quite a bark, just enough to say he was listening. Earlier that morning, the woman at the auction counter had looked at him like he was buying a curse. She hadn't said a word, just handed him the papers with a hand that trembled a little too much for a room with heating. Then Abernathy at the general store had tried to warn him off, told him stories about a missing journalist, strange noises in the woods, trespassers who never came back. But Nate didn't buy into local ghost tales. He'd seen enough real evil to stop believing in the supernatural. Until his dog started growling at a fireplace. Nate leaned forward, grabbed one of the journals from the table, and opened it again. The pages smelled like damp and old ink. The handwriting was clean, deliberate. The kind of script someone had been trained to use, maybe a former academic. One line caught his eye. They said the water would be safe, but it made the deer foam at the mouth. He read it twice, closed the book. So this place wasn't haunted. It was buried. And someone had gone to a lot of trouble to keep it that way. He looked at Hunter again. The dog was up now, pacing, not frantic, just unsettled. His nails tapped lightly across the wood floor, a sound Nate knew by heart. Tap, tap, turn, tap, tap, pause, back to the hearth. "You're not letting this go, are you?" Hunter sat down again, tail wrapped around his feet, chest high, watching, guarding. That was the thing about him. He didn't just protect Nate, he protected the truth. He could smell lies the same way he once smelled ammonium nitrate, buried under a layer of Afghan dirt. Nate sighed and rubbed his eyes. He didn't come here for this. Didn't buy a half-frozen sagging cabin in the woods of Vermont to get involved in someone else's old war. But now it wasn't someone else's anymore. He reached for his thermos and took a sip of the coffee. Lukewarm, bitter, ground too coarse, still better than MREs. "Okay," he muttered. "Let's say there's something here. Something bad enough to get a reporter disappeared and a whole town to pretend this place doesn't exist. What do they do when they find out I know?" Hunter didn't move. Nate leaned back, closed his eyes for a second, and tried to forget the feeling of the stone shifting under his fingers, the mortar breaking like an old scab, the weight of the box in his arms. Tried to forget that the only reason he'd found it was because a dog he trusted with his life decided to bark at ghosts. But he couldn't, because ghosts didn't growl, and Hunter never barked, unless it mattered. The blizzard deepened overnight, blanketing the cabin in a suffocating silence broken only by the shriek of wind through the trees. The snow came down in waves, thick and wet, clinging to the windows like nature was trying to seal the place shut from the world. Nate woke stiff in his sleeping bag, the fire long since burned down to coals. He pulled himself upright, muscles sore, breath fogging in the cold air. Hunter was already up. The dog stood rigid at the base of the fireplace, hackles raised, ears angled forward, not barking, not growling, but poised, like a tripwire pulled tight. Nate rubbed sleep from his eyes and sat still, watching the dog's body language. Something was coming, or maybe it was already here. "Easy, buddy," Nate whispered. Hunter's gaze didn't shift. Then, with no warning, he began to dig. His front paws clawed at the stone base of the hearth, nails scraping against the mortar with a force Nate had never seen from him. Dust puffed into the air with each strike. It wasn't frantic, though. It was precise, measured, deliberate. "Hunter, what the hell are you doing?" Nate got to his feet, grabbed his jacket and moved to the dog's side. Hunter didn't stop. One paw, then the other. He scratched at the same spot, again and again. The sound was sharp in the quiet cabin, like someone dragging metal across bone. Nate crouched beside him and reached out, brushing his hand over the area. At first, it looked like any other part of the stone floor. But as Nate looked closer, he saw the edges of one slab were cleaner, almost too clean. The mortar around it was slightly different in color, darker, rubbery, not crumbling like the rest. It had been sealed. Not mortared. Sealed. His breath caught. He stood, grabbed the crowbar from where it leaned against the wall, and jammed it into the narrow seam along the edge of the stone. He pressed down. Nothing. Repositioned. Tried again. A crack echoed through the room as the seal gave way. The slab shifted a fraction of an inch. Hunter stepped back, tail low, eyes never leaving the stone. "Good boy," Nate murmured. He worked the crowbar along each side until finally, with one final groan, the stone lifted. He grasped the edge with both hands and heaved it free, muscles straining, breath tight in his throat. It landed beside him with a solid thud. Beneath it was a cavity. Rough-hewn stone, maybe 3 feet deep, lined with what looked like field stones and flattened earth. It was dry, untouched by moisture or rot. At the bottom sat a dark green metal box, military issue, scuffed, with rust around the hinges. And beside it, a stack of 3 leather-bound notebooks tied together with a brittle piece of cord. Nate stared. Hunter sat beside him again, tail thumping once on the floor, a low whuff in his throat. The tension in his body had eased slightly, but not completely. "Jesus," Nate whispered. He reached into the hole and pulled the box out. It was heavier than expected. Dense, not empty. The notebooks came next, the leather dry and flaking at the corners. He moved both onto the nearby table, then sat down, heart racing. His fingers hesitated on the box's latches. He didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, he untied the cord around the notebooks and opened the top one. The pages were filled with crisp, deliberate handwriting, dense, black ink, no smudges, organized like a journal, but more controlled, as if written by someone used to documentation, someone trained to observe. At the top of the first page, Edgar Miles, Sept 16th. The name stopped Nate cold. He'd heard it only once or twice in passing. A missing person, a reporter, someone from the outside who'd come to Vermont decades ago and never left. The last sighting had been in this valley. Locals called it rumor, then stopped calling it anything at all. Nate turned the page. The early entries were benign. Descriptions of wildlife, the landscape, weather patterns. But even then, something crept beneath the surface. A sense of isolation, of eyes in the trees, of silence that felt like surveillance. Then the content shifted. Miles began detailing strange encounters, county officials showing up unannounced, letters left without postmarks, a surveyor's drone flying low over his roof. He wrote about the water near the north end of the property tasting off, metallic, about his neighbor's livestock falling ill, about barrels buried in frozen ground, then suddenly gone weeks later. Nate flipped ahead. The handwriting grew more urgent, not sloppy but tighter, pressed harder into the page. The ink darkened where the pen scratched deeper. One entry caught his eye. I confronted them. I told them I knew what GeoNorth was doing, that I'd seen the maps, that I had copies. Sheriff told me to leave it alone. Next day my brakes failed. GeoNorth. That name Nate didn't know, but he'd seen things like this before. Not in America. Not on paper. But in behavior. The same pattern he'd watched corrupt officials use in Fallujah, in small outposts where eyes never reached. Intimidate. Silence. Erase. He looked over at Hunter, who had laid down at last, chin resting on his paws, eyes still open, still facing the hearth. Did you know? Nate whispered. Hunter gave no response, but his presence was answer enough. Nate closed the notebook and looked back at the fire. Something burned differently now, not the wood, but the air around it. Like it knew its secret had been unearthed, like it was watching. He reached back down into the hole and felt along the sides, but there was nothing else. No trap, no wires, no bones, just words. Buried and waiting. He turned to the box. Unlatching it with steady hands, he lifted the lid and froze. Inside, meticulously packed, were vials of water samples, soil sealed in small bags, and lab reports with GeoNorth's name stamped faintly in the corners. Each page was dated, each location marked. All of it was evidence. Hunter let out a low, soft sound. Not a growl, not a warning, just a breath. Nate closed the box gently and looked around the cabin. This wasn't just a home, it was a grave. And Edgar Miles had left behind a map, a whisper through stone and snow that had waited 2 decades for someone to listen, someone with a dog who never barked without a reason. The blizzard broke just after dawn, leaving behind a landscape sculpted in white silence. Snow weighed heavy on the pine branches, and the only sound outside was the occasional crack of ice surrendering to gravity. Inside the cabin, the fire had been rebuilt and was burning steady, casting a warm glow over the wooden walls. The air smelled of pine smoke, burnt coffee, and something else. Tension. Hunter lay stretched out near the hearth, his eyes not quite closed, his ears still rotating toward every creak and shift in the old structure. He hadn't barked again, but he hadn't fully relaxed either. Nate had learned to read his stillness as carefully as other people read words. The dog was listening. Nate himself sat at the table, a mug of strong coffee in hand, staring at the unopened green metal box. He hadn't dug deeper into the contents yet. The vials, the soil, the names on the reports. He'd skimmed enough to know the evidence was real, dangerous, but the full story was still folded tight within those notebooks, waiting for him. A knock shattered the quiet. 3 quick, deliberate raps. Nate froze. So did Hunter. Then the shepherd stood in one smooth motion, turned toward the door, and let out a deep, unmistakable growl. Nate stood slowly, coffee forgotten. The growl deepened. Another knock. Hunter was already halfway to the door, his entire body bristling, posture low, ears forward, tail stiff. His growl was no longer a warning. It was a message. Nate grabbed his jacket, slid his hand behind the stove where the old hunting rifle leaned against the wall, then walked to the door. He opened it just a crack. A man stood on the porch, tall, wide-shouldered, and wrapped in a brown uniform coat with a gold star stitched above the left breast. Sheriff's badge, thick mustache, hat pulled low against the cold. His breath fogged in the air. "Mornin'," the man said. Beautiful day after all that mess, huh? Hunter lunged against the doorframe with a bark so sharp it cracked like a shot. Nate shoved the door back half an inch to keep the dog from forcing it open. The sheriff didn't flinch, just looked down at the dog with something between curiosity and calculation. "Didn't mean to startle your friend there. Sheriff Eli Porter," he said, tapping the badge. "Mind if I step in for a second? Just checking in." Nate looked at him carefully. "Cabin's a little tight. I can step outside." Porter smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Fair enough." Nate turned to Hunter. "Stay," he ordered. Hunter didn't move from the doorway, but held his position with a quiet intensity that spoke louder than any command. Nate stepped onto the porch and shut the door behind him, the latch clicking softly. "What brings you out here?" he asked. "County records show the deed just changed hands. Figured I'd stop by and make sure you made it through the storm all right. This place ain't exactly a luxury resort." "I've seen worse," Nate replied. Porter chuckled. "I bet you have, Mr. Grayson. Word travels quick in small towns. Former Marine, right?" Nate didn't answer. Not directly. "Didn't expect company this early. Didn't expect you to buy this place, to be honest. No one's touched it in over 20 years. Not since Edgar Miles went missing." There it was. Too casual to be casual. Nate kept his face neutral. "That name's been mentioned." Porter leaned against the railing. "Reporter, outsider. Came out here sniffing around some corporate land dealings. Never did make it back out. Locals say he probably ran into a bear, but his truck was still here. Keys in the ignition." Nate said nothing. Just let the man talk. Porter's gaze sharpened. "You find anything unusual in the cabin?" "Besides a door that sticks and a fireplace that smokes? Not really." "You've been busy, though." He nodded at the tracks in the snow. "Looks like you've been hauling something. Supplies from the truck." Porter nodded slowly. Then his voice lowered just a fraction. "See, I always liked this place. Used to come up here hunting with my uncle when I was a boy, back when the woods weren't crawling with hikers and weekend survivalists. Real quiet back then. Peaceful." Nate folded his arms. "You got a point coming?" "Just making conversation," Porter said. Then he looked Nate dead in the eye. "But I'd hate to see something happen to that peace, to someone who thought he was settling down, only to find he stirred up something best left buried." There it was. Not even a threat, just a statement. Quiet, polite, laced with steel. "Appreciate the concern," Nate said flatly. "I'll let you know if I see any ghosts." Porter chuckled again, tipped his hat. "You do that, and if anything comes up, anything strange, you know where to find me." He turned and walked back through the snow, boots crunching slow and measured. Nate watched until the man climbed into his SUV and drove away down the winding trail. Only then did he go back inside. Hunter hadn't moved from the door. The growl had faded, but his eyes were still alert, focused. Nate knelt and rubbed his thick fur. "You didn't like him either, huh?" Hunter pressed his head lightly against Nate's shoulder, and for a moment the man felt the quiet tremor beneath the dog's skin. Not fear, tension, preparedness. Nate stood and locked the door, bolting it top and bottom. Then he went to the window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to watch the SUV disappear behind the trees. Porter hadn't come out to be friendly. He had come to deliver a message. They knew he was here, and someone wanted to know how much he'd already found. The light outside had taken on that pale, cold quality that comes just before another storm. Snow still covered everything, but it had stopped falling, for now. Inside, the fire hissed and popped, but Nate didn't hear it. He was hunched over the cabin's old wooden table, sleeves rolled up, head low, and eyes locked on the open journal before him. Hunter sat by the front window, completely still. He hadn't moved for 20 minutes. That alone made Nate nervous. The dog's ears twitched every few seconds, tracking something distant. His eyes never left the tree line beyond the clearing, even though the snowfall had erased most of it. It was that unblinking stare Nate had come to trust. And fear, because it meant the clock had started ticking. Nate looked back down at the page, hand moving to turn it. The journal crackled softly. He flipped past several entries, his fingers slightly shaking, not from the cold, but from what he was starting to piece together. Edgar Miles had been meticulous. The man had mapped everything. Page after page documented water tests, arsenic levels, soil samples, GPS coordinates. At first it had read like over-preparedness, a man too deep in his own theories. But then came the copies of real lab results, samples sent to a private environmental lab out of state, sealed in numbered vials and labeled by location. The results weren't just concerning. They were catastrophic. Heavy metals, hydrocarbons, toxic solvent residue. Some of the numbers exceeded federal safety limits by factors of 10, even 20. These weren't random spots. They followed a pattern, like dots on a grid. Every marked site traced the shape of the valley's natural watershed. The poisoning wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, and it had been happening for years. Nate slowly unfolded the piece of paper that had been tucked between 2 pages. It was a hand-drawn topographic map, edges frayed, creased in quadrants. Red circles had been inked across it. Not just a few, dozens. All in remote locations, some with dates, others with annotations like retest, March 2001, or too close to well, confirmed dilution rate. And in the bottom corner, underlined twice in fading red pen, was one word: geocore. Nate leaned back in his chair, running both hands through his hair. He looked at Hunter. The dog didn't turn his head. He didn't have to. Nate stood, walked quietly to the window beside his partner, and peered out through the frost-covered glass. The forest was still. Too still. Hunter gave a low, barely audible whine, more breath than sound. That was enough. We need to move. Nate muttered. Back at the table, he laid out what he needed. The most damning journal pages, the water sample data, and a photograph he found taped inside one of the covers. A blurred image of several black barrels half buried near a frozen creek bed, marked with industrial warning labels. He slipped each document into a waterproof sleeve, one he had kept from his deployment days. The kind used for mission plans in wet zones. He opened the green ammo box again and carefully selected 5 vials, all dated, all labeled. The labels were fragile, handwritten, but still legible. Then he pulled a small canvas satchel from his pack and placed everything inside. Zip. Secure. No margin for error. He glanced toward the radio on the shelf. Still dead. The storm had knocked out any chance of calling someone directly. The only way to get this out was physically, and he knew exactly who to send it to. Mark Jensen. They'd served in the same unit during their second tour. Mark had been the team's communications lead, smart, fast, always 3 steps ahead. After the military, he'd gone into investigative journalism and now ran stories for a national platform out of Denver. Mark didn't chase headlines. He chased the truth, the kind of man who didn't flinch when the stakes got ugly. Nate dug out the old burner phone he'd charged in town before the storm. Still powered, still had one contact stored from years ago, Mark's number. But he wouldn't call yet, not until the package was in motion. Back at the table, Hunter finally turned his head. Just slightly, eyes locking with Nate's. The room was quiet, but the look said everything. Someone was coming. Nate closed the satchel and buckled it tight. Then he knelt beside Hunter. "You were right from the start," he whispered. "Whatever's going on here, it runs deep." Hunter's ears pinned back, and his nose twitched toward the door. One paw lifted, alert posture. Nate stood and double-checked the window's lock, then the back door, then the makeshift brace on the front. They weren't safe anymore, not just because of the evidence, but because someone, Sheriff Porter, Geocorps, whoever else had been watching this land, knew they had crossed a line. Hunter stepped closer, close enough that Nate could feel the dog's warmth at his leg. "We'll wait till nightfall," Nate said, "then we move." Hunter gave a low exhale. It sounded like agreement. Outside, the sky had gone a dull, leaden grey again. Snow would start soon, maybe sleet. The weather would work in their favor, covering their tracks, hiding their exit. But it also meant they had a deadline. Nate stood at the hearth and looked down at the space where the slab had been. He hadn't covered it back up yet. He considered sealing it again, hiding the rest. The cabin might not survive what was coming next, but the truth would. He looked back at the table, at the map, at the red circles bleeding across the valley. They told a story, a company poisoning a watershed, a reporter who disappeared for getting too close, a town that looked away, and a dog who refused to. Hunter returned to the window. He sat tall, unmoving, scanning the trees. A sentinel. Nate tucked the satchel under his coat, hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. Whatever was coming next, they were ready. They had to be. The fire was burning low, casting long shadows that flickered across the log walls like restless ghosts. Nate sat at the table, the map from Edgar Miles spread out in front of him, pages of copied notes stacked in precise piles. Every red circle, every faded annotation, it was all beginning to form a story that made sense, a story someone had tried hard to bury. Hunter lay nearby, his head resting between his paws, seemingly relaxed, but with ears that twitched at every small sound. Outside, the wind had quieted. The snow, for once, had stopped. Too quiet, Nate thought. He reached for his thermos, poured what was left of the lukewarm coffee into his mug, and took a sip. Then suddenly, Hunter shot to his feet with a sharp, high-pitched rough that cut the air like a blade. Nate dropped the mug, grabbed the flashlight and his sidearm in the same motion. Hunter was already moving, bolting across the room and slamming his front paws against the lower pane of the front window. His body was taut, his bark now deep and steady, shaking with warning. "Hunter, back!" Nate hissed, and the dog instantly obeyed, retreating to the wall beside the door. Nate killed the lantern with a twist of his fingers. Darkness swallowed the room. Only the faint red glow from the fire's embers remained, and even that was quickly fading. His eyes adjusted. Outside, the snow reflected enough light to make out shapes. The trees, the outline of the trail, and then movement, a silhouette, dark and lean, creeping toward the rear of the cabin. Slow, purposeful, not the clumsy wandering of someone lost in the woods. This was practiced, trained, hands close to the body. Low steps, a shadow with intent. Nate's breath caught in his throat. He moved fast but silent, stepping over the rug to avoid creaking boards, gesturing for Hunter to hold his position. The dog understood. He didn't growl, he didn't bark. He was still, coiled. Nate crept towards the back door. He pressed himself against the wall and waited, straining his ears. Then, just barely, he heard it. A gloved hand scraping against the door frame. A soft click of metal on wood. The lock. Nate raised his pistol, safety off. The doorknob turned. The door cracked open a half-inch, and then everything happened at once. Hunter exploded into motion, launching toward the rear door like a missile. The door swung wide as a man in black pushed through, mask over his face, a short-barreled weapon in hand, but he never had the chance to raise it. 90 pounds of pure muscle slammed into him, knocking him off balance with a grunt of surprise. They hit the floor hard. Hunter didn't bite. Not yet. He pinned the man with a trained precision, his weight holding the intruder's chest down, front paws digging in just beneath the shoulders. The man screamed, a ragged, panicked sound, and flailed, trying to shake the dog. "Don't move!" Nate snapped, weapon aimed squarely at the man's head. The intruder froze. His eyes were wide, frantic beneath the mask. His hand twitched toward his hip. "Try it," Nate said coldly. The man hesitated. Then Hunter let out a guttural growl, his teeth just barely exposed. That made the decision for him. The intruder went still. "Who sent you?" Nate barked. No answer. "Talk, now." Still nothing. Just that look in the man's eyes, not fear, but something else. Desperation. And then it shifted. The man gritted his teeth and shouted, voice cracking with urgency. "Burn it! Burn it all!" It was a message. Not to Nate. To someone else. Then he jerked his knee hard into Hunter's chest and rolled, fast and fluid, breaking free just long enough to scramble out the door and into the snow. Nate cursed and moved to follow, but by the time he reached the threshold, the man had vanished into the woods. Only the rustle of underbrush and fading footprints gave any hint he'd been there at all. Hunter stood beside Nate, chest heaving, tail high, eyes scanning the tree line. Every hair on his back stood upright. Nate lowered his weapon, slowly closed the door, and bolted it shut. The message was clear now. Whoever was behind this didn't just want to scare him. They didn't just want to silence Edgar Miles's story. They wanted to erase it. All of it. Hunter circled the room once, sniffed the floor where the man had fallen, then returned to Nate's side. He didn't sit this time. He stood facing the door, alert, guarding. Nate picked up the scattered notes and began to repack them into the satchel. Every second now mattered. The evidence had to leave this place. Tonight, if possible. The fire hissed low behind him, and the shadows danced once more along the walls. But this time, the threat wasn't imagined. It was real, and it had just come through his back door. It started with the scent. Not smoke, not yet. Just the faintest chemical edge on the cold mountain air. Nate was sealing the last of the documents into a waterproof pouch, getting ready to hike out by dawn. Hunter stood by the door, ears perked, nose twitching. He let out a low growl, not of fear, but warning. Nate didn't hesitate. He'd learned long ago to trust that sound. He moved to the window, cracked it just enough to feel the outside temperature shift. The night was still, snow blanketing the ground in an untouched white. But then came the whisper of movement, a shadow darting between trees. Another. Hunter stiffened. Nate grabbed his sidearm, slung the pack over one shoulder, and crossed to the back where he'd left the duffel with the satellite transmitter. It was blinking green. The files had just finished sending. Whoever received them now had everything. Edgar Miles's story wouldn't die with the cabin. He was halfway to the front when he saw it. A flash. A bottle, arcing through the air. "Get down!" The window exploded in fire. Glass shattered. A whoosh of flames sucked oxygen from the room in a single violent breath. Curtains caught instantly. The dry wood walls followed. The air turned thick and screaming hot. Hunter lunged, teeth snapping toward Nate's arm, not in aggression, but to pull him back from the blaze. Nate stumbled, coughing, heat tearing at his lungs. Another bottle crashed through the rear window. Fire bloomed across the ceiling like a living thing, crawling and hissing. They were being surrounded, trapped. The cabin, his shelter, was now a death trap. "Go, Hunter!" Nate shouted, shoving open the rear door with his boot. The cold hit like a slap, but so did the relief of breathable air. Hunter bolted out first, spinning around to make sure Nate followed. Outside, the night was chaos. 2 men flanked the cabin's sides, Molotovs in hand. Nate raised his weapon and fired. One went down with a grunt. The other dropped the bottle and ran into the trees. Hunter didn't pursue. He stayed by Nate. The flames behind them grew louder, brighter. They lit the snow in pulsing orange, casting eerie shadows across the trees. The cabin groaned as the roof began to cave. "Move!" Nate yelled, and they did, into the woods, boots crunching snow, breaths forming clouds of steam, branches clawed at them. The night closed in, dark and endless. But Hunter led, weaving through the narrowest paths, always just a few steps ahead, tail rigid, eyes locked on the terrain. Nate followed, heart pounding, lungs burning from smoke and cold. They didn't stop for miles. Not until they reached the frozen creek Nate had marked earlier that week. There, beneath a low ridge, they crouched. Nate scanned the tree line with his scope. No movement, no pursuit. Only then did he notice the smell. Burned fur. He turned to Hunter. The dog stood tall, chest heaving, eyes sharp, but his left flank was singed, skin raw beneath a patch of charred coat. He hadn't made a sound. Not a whimper, not a limp. Nate dropped to one knee. "You're hurt." Hunter sat, barely, and leaned into him like he always did when Nate needed grounding more than comfort. Nate dug out a first aid kit from his pack. The ointment stung, but Hunter didn't flinch. His breathing slowed as Nate worked. The bond between them, tested in deserts and gunfire, held fast in the cold silence of the forest. "Thank you," Nate whispered. Hunter thumped his tail once. Behind them, the sky flickered red. The fire had taken everything. Edgar's journals, the physical evidence, the maps, the home Nate had built with his own hands. Gone. But the digital files had made it out. And so had they. Hunter curled beside Nate beneath the ridge. His ears twitched, but his body remained tense. Watching. Guarding. Nate rested one hand on the dog's back. They had nothing left but each other and the truth. And now the truth had to survive. It started as a distant pulse. A low, rhythmic thump that didn't belong to the wind or the trees. Nate opened his eyes from where he sat, curled against the frozen ridge, hand resting gently on Hunter's singed fur. The German shepherd's ears perked up first. He was already standing before the sound grew loud enough for human ears. Nate sat up straighter. The sound was unmistakable now. Rotors, multiple helicopters moving fast. Hunter didn't bark. He simply stood at alert, nose high, tail steady. His body language said it all. This wasn't another attack. This was something else. By the time the first chopper came into view over the trees, Nate's satellite phone lit up. A single message blinked across the cracked screen. "I made the call. You're not alone. MK." Mark Keaton. His old teammate from a sand-swept outpost in Iraq, back when war was a full-time job and trust was a rare currency. Mark had left the military for journalism. Real journalism. The kind that got people killed or made enemies out of governments. Nate had only one person in the world he could trust with Edgar Miles's files. And Mark had come through. The first Black Hawk banked low over the valley, its downdraft sending snow flying like dust off a forgotten tomb. Then a second, then a third. Nate shielded his eyes as Hunter stood his ground, squinting up at the sky with the same calm focus he'd used in combat zones. He didn't flinch when boots hit the ground. FBI agents in tactical gear fanned out, weapons drawn but lowered as they approached. One of them, a woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense jawline and frost still clinging to her collar, spotted Nate. "Sergeant Walsh?" she shouted over the roar. Nate nodded. "The files made it?" "They made it," she said, stepping forward. "And so did you. Barely." He motioned to Hunter. "I didn't do it alone." Her eyes met the dog's. She gave a single, sharp nod. "We owe him too." Moments later, the agents began swarming the charred ruins of the cabin, cordoning off the area, collecting what little remained. Nate watched from the tree line, Hunter pressed close to his knee. A medic crouched beside them, tending to the dog's burns with practiced care. Hunter didn't pull away. He didn't even blink. Nate's mind spun faster than the rotor blades. If the files got out, that meant Mark had traced the paper trail. They'd know about Geocore. They'd know about Sheriff Porter. The woman returned a few minutes later, her phone to her ear. She looked pale, like she'd just walked out of a courtroom where the jury had come back guilty. "It's real," she said quietly, phone still pressed to her cheek. "The EPA is confirming contamination levels, cancer clusters, bribery, land seizure." Nate nodded slowly. He already knew. The dam had cracked. Across the valley, a convoy of black SUVs appeared like a line of beetles crawling across snow. Out stepped more agents, and among them, Mark Keaton, himself, older, grayer, wearing the same beat-up leather jacket from their deployment years, a camera slung around his chest. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Hell of a way to say hi again," he said. "You always did like fireworks," Nate replied. Mark's face turned serious. "Porter's already in custody. He tried to run when they showed up at his ranch this morning. They got the financials. It's bad, Nate. Real bad." "Good," Nate said. "Let it all burn." Mark gestured to Hunter. "He took a hit. Burned," Nate said. "But he never left my side." Mark knelt, reaching out a hand. Hunter sniffed it, then leaned in, allowing a gentle pat. "I remember you in Fallujah," Mark whispered to the dog. "Still a warrior." Later, they stood together near what had once been Nate's cabin. The wreckage still smoked faintly, a black smear on the white landscape. But the rot that had festered beneath this land for 20 years, that was no longer hidden. Geocore was being dismantled from the top down, their executives subpoenaed, properties frozen. The small town that had trusted its sheriff and its water supply now faced a reckoning. Nate stared at the sky as another helicopter came in, this one marked with the seal of the Justice Department. He felt no victory, just exhaustion. Hunter nudged his thigh gently, breaking him from the fog. "Still here, huh?" Nate murmured. The dog sat beside him, eyes scanning the horizon like a soldier waiting for the next call. Nate reached down, fingers threading through the coarse fur behind his ears. "We're not done," he said. "Not yet." Hunter didn't wag his tail. He just looked forward. Always forward. The press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m., but by 9:30 the small town courthouse steps were already packed. Reporters jostled for space behind the barricades, camera lenses stretching toward the podium like vultures scenting blood. Snow flurries danced in the cold October air, catching in microphone foam and jacket collars. Inside, Nate stood in the hallway, adjusting the collar of his borrowed suit. It was a shade too tight across the shoulders. He hadn't worn a tie since his court-martial hearing 10 years ago, and even then it felt more like a noose than a formality. Hunter sat beside him, still and calm. His burned side was healing, though the fur had yet to fully grow back. The medical team offered to sedate him for the crowd, but Nate knew better. This wasn't just about facing cameras. It was about showing the world who had really saved them. The door opened. A young aide peeked through. "They're ready for you, sir." Nate gave a single nod and looked down at Hunter. "Come on, buddy, let's finish this." They stepped out together. The applause began before he reached the podium. Not polite clapping, but something deeper, grateful roar, rising like a wave. It wasn't just about the files or the fall of Geocore. It was for the man who stood his ground, and the dog who refused to run. Flashes burst like fireworks. Questions were already being shouted. "Mr. Walsh, how did you uncover the connection between the sheriff and the company? Did you plan the data leak?" Are you cooperating with the Department of Justice? Nate didn't flinch. He raised a hand. The crowd quieted. I'm not a politician, he said, his voice steady but low. I didn't come here for credit. I came here because people were dying, because no one else was listening. He paused, then glanced down. Hunter met his eyes. This dog, Nate continued, voice cracking just slightly, pulled me out of a fire. He dragged a wounded man through snow. He stood between me and bullets. He led me to the truth. I didn't uncover anything. I just followed him. The silence was absolute. Then, as if on cue, Hunter rose and walked to the edge of the stage. He sat squarely in front of the crowd, chest high, eyes scanning the sea of faces. He didn't bark. He didn't need to. For a moment, it was as if every person saw the same thing. Not a dog, but a soldier. Not just loyal, but righteous. The moderator stepped forward, clearly rattled, and began listing the pending charges against GeoCorps executives, against Sheriff Porter, against the local officials who'd taken bribes to keep the contamination buried. But no one was listening anymore. All eyes were still on the dog. Back inside, after the cameras had packed up and the reporters were ushered out, Nate sat on a bench in the hallway, his jacket draped over one knee. Hunter rested at his feet, finally exhaling. Mark Keaton walked up with 2 coffees, handing one off. You know they're going to name a park after him? Nate snorted. He'd hate that. Probably pee on the sign. They both chuckled, but the air between them turned somber again. I read the full EPA report, Mark said. It's worse than we thought. They were dumping toxic waste into the groundwater for 15 years. Kids got cancer. Old folks dropped dead. Livestock poisoned. Yeah, Nate said quietly. I know. You should be furious. I am, but mostly I'm just tired. Hunter stirred, as if sensing the shift in tone, and placed his head on Nate's boot. You gonna stick around? Mark asked. They're offering protection, housing, even a medal. Nate looked down at Hunter. We're not the medal type. Later, as the sun began to set, Nate walked alone with Hunter along the frozen riverbank behind the courthouse. The snow had turned to ice, the landscape brittle and clean. He knelt down in the frost. You never gave up, did you? Hunter looked at him, eyes as calm as the still water nearby. Not once. Nate buried his hand in the thick fur, right at the base of the dog's neck, the place that always felt like home. You showed me what loyalty really means, and what it costs. Hunter didn't move, but in the fading light, his presence seemed to glow just a little warmer. And in Nate's chest, something broke open, not with pain, but with the weight of having done what was right, no matter the cost. The world had called him a hero, but only Hunter knew the truth. The road to the new cabin was rougher than it used to be. The fire had taken out the old path along with everything else. Walls, roof, even the oak stump, where Nate used to split wood in the mornings. But the view was the same. The pines still swayed in rhythm with the wind. The air still smelled like clean snow and distant wood smoke. And Hunter still lay curled up on the porch, just beside the front door. Not to guard it, just to be near it. They had rebuilt with their own hands, not fast, not fancy, just steady. Beam by beam, nail by nail. Sometimes in silence, sometimes with the soft scrape of Hunter dragging tools closer like a shaggy foreman. When the nights turned cold, Nate would lie beside the wood stove, Hunter at his feet, and both would sleep soundly, without flinching at distant noises or phantom footsteps. Nate had declined interviews, awards, even a commemorative plaque from the governor's office. He wasn't interested in being anyone's symbol. But when the local high school invited him to speak to a journalism class, he surprised even himself by saying yes. He didn't wear a suit this time. Just jeans, a clean flannel, and boots caked with thawing mud. Hunter trotted behind him down the hallway, tail high, paws clicking against the linoleum like they owned the place. In a way, they did. The classroom was smaller than Nate remembered. Half the kids looked more interested in their phones than the man walking in. But when Hunter entered, the room shifted. Several students sat up straighter. One girl dropped her pen. A boy near the back whispered, "That's the dog from the article." Nate gave a nod to the teacher and turned to face the class. "You're here because you want to find the truth," he said. "Or at least you think you do." A few chuckles. "Well, here's what I learned. The truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it barks." He glanced down. Hunter stood beside him, eyes on the students. One of the teens raised her hand. "Is it true your dog saved your life?" "No," Nate replied. "It's more than that. He saved my sense of right and wrong." Another student, skinny, nervous, spoke up. "I read your story. Someone said you were going to leave Vermont. Why'd you stay?" Nate looked out the classroom window. Snow was starting to fall again. Quiet. Soft. Familiar. "Because I wanted to build something honest. From scratch, just like he did." That night, back at the cabin, Nate sat on the front steps with a tin mug of black coffee. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of coyotes from somewhere down the ridge. Hunter stirred, but didn't rise. His head was resting on Nate's boot. A car pulled into the gravel drive. Slowly, carefully. The driver got out. It was the student from earlier, the nervous one. He carried a notepad and a small tape recorder. "I won't stay long," the boy said. "But there's a quote I didn't get to tell you in class." Nate nodded. "Go ahead." The kid looked at Hunter, then back at Nate. "My granddad used to say, 'That dog didn't just bark at ghosts, he barked at the truth.'" Nate smiled. Not wide, just enough. "That's a good line." The boy lingered for a second, then turned back toward his car. Hunter didn't move. Just flicked his ear, content. Inside the cabin, above the mantel, hung one thing. Not a medal, not a certificate, but an old photograph. It showed a younger Nate, in fatigues, and a fresh-faced Hunter beside him, ears too big for his head, already alert. Below the frame, carved into the wood, were 4 words: truth, loyalty, fire, return. Hunter had returned. So had Nate. They didn't win awards. They didn't want them. But they had rebuilt something that mattered. And somewhere, someone would read their story. Maybe whisper it to a friend. Maybe tell it to a child staring wide-eyed at a dog asleep in the corner of the room. Because some stories don't fade. They settle. Like snow. Like memory. So tell us, what's your story with a loyal pet? And if this one moved you even just a little, support our channel German Shepherd. Share it. Comment below. Subscribe. There's always another story waiting to be told. Maybe yours is next.